In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners and readers and all you crazy people out there. It's the Sublation Magazine show again. This week, we're going to be tackling, well, as always, I'm kind of obsessed about this. We're going to be talking about the Twitter files and Matt Taibbi and all of that kind of thing. But we're also going to be trying to put this in the context of the control society, Neofeudalism, and the overarching crisis. The crisis is a political crisis, the crisis of neoliberalism, the crisis that is connected to the kind of underlying crisis within capitalism itself, that has not really subsided since 2008, and really comes back again and again throughout the history of capitalism's development. And we're going to be trying to figure out what has happened to the left as the changes in our politics and our technology and our society has taken place. So I am noting that the left, even Marxists on the left, seem to be slow to take up what's really the new reality that we're facing in this moment. So, Ashley, you've been reading about Neofeudalism. How do you see that, just briefly?
So I have been trying to update my knowledge on crisis theory because I hate that I just go back to these sort of comfortable kinds of areas that, I learned that I was satisfied with as the explanation for the 2008 crisis, that I think that there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I've been convinced by that for a number of reasons. I think probably the most convincing thing was when someone sent me some papers by mainstream economists who apparently completely oblivious to, the whole debate that had been raging for like hundreds of years. We're like, hey, there seems to be this weird rate of profit falling. Just sort of like observed this completely anti-ideologically or pre-ideologically. But then I kind of wanted to get ahead of this crisis that's coming and kind of not assume what I set out to find. And one thing that I have noticed is there is something happening in society. And it's something that I noticed a few times when I was studying cultural forms, like the article that I wrote for Sublation magazine on the carnival of cancel culture, which was based on an article I'd written a few years before when I described the treatment of various people as medieval. And I found myself saying, gosh, that's medieval, not only in relation to cancel culture, but in relation to more and more things. And I just started noticing qualitatively that there are these surface level similarities. And when you see something like that, it points you to the question, if there are changes in our cultural forms that superficially at least speak to some kind of medieval patterns, does that reflect a deeper change in our mode of production? And I don't know if it does. There are all sorts of other explanations, but an observation like that at a cultural level directs your attention to, first of all, trying to study those cultural forms, and then perhaps digging down to see, well, maybe there is some shift at an economic level. And it's actually a very, very difficult thing to do. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is, for my videos this month, I've been trying to read and get a sense of some of that literature. And what I have found is that a lot of it is that kind of, which is very, very useful, but that sort of qualitative kind of surface level approach. We're sort of, this is very similar. These characteristics have similarities. And there's a little bit of a Marxist kind of relational approach where it's like, well, in feudalism, the mode of expropriation was not purely economic. It was also political. or was actually mostly political, where the peasants actually had a lot of control over the productive process, and extraction was political. Whereas in capitalism, expropriation is, I hope I'm not going too far over people's heads already.
No.
But
I'm following along. Keep going.
Yeah. So the expropriation in capitalism is at least based on an equal exchange. We come to the workforce, or we come to work as we become workers in a situation of freedom, heavily, freedom. Obviously, we are free from the land, as the peasants were not. We are so free indeed, we are free to starve. So we freely sell our labor, and we get back the value of our labor power. Sorry, when I said we freely sell our labor, I mean we freely sell our labor power. And we get back the value of that. But we don't. So that this equal exchange hides something that happens in the productive process, where you work, but you work some of that time not
for the boss.
It doesn't, for the boss. Doesn't cover your wages, etc. So you continue working even after your wages are paid. So that's where the expropriation is. Whereas for a peasant, you would have seen, you work, and you would literally see, you would cart your produce to the feudal lord, give it to the feudal lord. The expropriation was part of an agreement, right? But for us, it's not the same thing. And so what some Marxist theorists have said is that while a lot of the expropriation now is something similar to that, it's becoming more a kind of political expropriation. It's becoming less economic, and there's more sort of like rent extraction and all of these sorts of things. And so there is a more kind of relational approach going on.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, from what I'm reading, a lot of it is qualitative. It is like, oh, this is happening, and this is similar. So for example, I've got a list in all the literature of all the characteristics people have said are similar.
Hold on there, Ashley. Let's come back to that, okay? Because what I want to point out is just that you're not alone.
I'm not, by the way, sorry, I just wanted to say really quickly, someone says an agreement. No, I don't mean like you're like, oh yes, exploit me. I mean, like there's something political happening, that it's not economic. It's happening in the sphere of politics in some way. That's all I mean in like the very broadest sense. I'm just trying to give like a whistle-stop tour of these kinds of different approaches. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just so eager to get to my notes on this Mehdi Hassan interview. I want to come back to the discussion of neofeudalism, because I think that the amount of control that the state is exercising over speech in general might in some way inform our understanding of what's meant by neofeudalism. And you're not alone in turning to this question of neofeudalism today, and whether it's right or not, whether or not there really is any kind of return to feudalism on the economic level, it is speaking to a change in the way that politics function, at very least. And
yes.
And so now I'd like to, I'm tweeting about this. I'm dreaming about this. It's consuming me. I guess I'm an obsessive.
Well, no, it actually dovetails quite nicely into my study, because this is part of some people's thesis, is this the fact that you are owned more fully by the boss in terms of your speech. And there's even discussion within neo-feudalist literature, which spans the left and right, about coerced speech, Jordan Peterson style. So yes, it wraps up quite well, and I will interject with my list.
Okay. So last week, Matt Taibbi, who's one of the journalists that's most prominently involved with reporting these documents that Elon Musk for a little while was allowing people to look at Twitter, was on MSNBC with Mehdi Hassan, and Mehdi is very good at talking over people, at speaking quickly, inflecting in a certain way to impugn the person he's talking to, and did what I think is basically a hit job on Taibbi. Taibbi should have been prepared for it and was not. But I want to run a clip from that and then address what was said there. So here's that clip.
You talk a lot about the Election Integrity Project in the Twitter files, which Stanford and the University of Washington founded to monitor attacks on our elections. And you say some stuff about them that a lot of your critics say is not true, and that affects your credibility. You said the EIP was founded in response to the government dropping its proposal for a disinformation government. Well, there you are. We're quoting you on screen. It wasn't. It was formed 2 years earlier. You suggest it was government funded, even though during the 2020 election that you're covering, it wasn't. You say they labeled 22 million tweets as misinformation in the run-up to the 2020 vote. They didn't. They flagged 3,000 election misinformation tweets for labeling, so you were only 21,997,000 off. And you also claim the EIP was... Let me finish the question. You can come back in. You also claim the EIP was partnered with the government cybersecurity and infrastructure agency, CISA, to censor Twitter. But you mix up CISA, CISA, a Homeland Security agency, with the Center for Internet Security, the CIS, which is a non-profit. In fact, you added an A to CIS. I think people can see it there in brackets to make that false claim. It's just error after error, Matt, on just this one topic.
An error. But the other ones aren't. The 22 million number came from their own report.
Yeah, it came from a report in March. Do you know what the 22 million number is, Matt? Can you tell me? Because we checked. 22 million is the number of tweets about election misinformation that they just mapped. How many tweets were they? The ones they actually flagged to Twitter before the election, 22 million came after the election. It wasn't in the run-up. They flagged 3,000. So you were off by 21,997,000. That's another error.
They said a lot of things. I stand by my story.
All right, so I have okay, so on Friday, there was I spent a lot of time on Twitter, maybe, and this time I think not stupidly, because there was a back and forth between not only Mehdi Hassan and Matt Taibbi, but between Michael Schellenberger and Alex Stamos, a guy named Mike Benz, who is, I guess, ex-FBI or some formerly with the security state, and Alex Stamos. So Alex Stamos is the head of the EIP. And in order to discredit Matt Taibbi, he tweeted out a link to the report that's being mentioned there in that clip, the report from the Election Integrity Project, which is partnered with the Department of Homeland Security through CISA or CISA, and which is also partnered with CIS, which is something like the Cybernetic Institute, Center for Internet Security, I think, or something like that, which is an academic nonprofit, and also partnered with the EIP. So look, I'm already losing track of all the different players here and the connections as I try to describe it. But this report from the Election Integrity Project, tweeted out by Alex Stamos, was very revealing. And I read through it. I didn't read every section, but I read the conclusion, and I read the section related to these 22 million tweets. So to begin with, to start with the error, the CIS is partnered with the CISA, and the CISA, or CISA, is an agency within the Department of Homeland Security. That's to begin with. The EIP is also partnered with CISA and the Department of Homeland Security as well, but through CISA probably. The academic project was founded after consultation with CISA, and that's how it began, was in consultation with and partnership with the Department of Homeland Security. Mehdi Hassan claims that the EIP wasn't funded by the federal government, but the details are as follows. Election Integrity Project works through and under the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, and they received funding through the Federal National Science Foundation, which is a federal agency. Now, the money from the FNS, Federal National Science Foundation, was not specifically earmarked for the Election Integrity Project's data gathering effort during the 100 days leading up to the 2020 election. Instead, the data gathering was done by students and staff who received funding through foundations such as the New Venture Fund, and that is the analysis. But the analysis of the data and final report from the Election Integrity Project was funded by the National Science Foundation. So while some of the money for EIP came from foundations set up by millionaires and billionaires, the New Venture Fund receives money from Bill Gates, for example. A good portion of it came from the state, and the project was working to, in the words of Alex Stamos, fill the gaps for the Department of Homeland Security. So that's what I want to start by saying. And just as a side note, after Alex Stamos engaged with Mike Binns and with Michael Schellenberger and with me, because I asked him a few questions, he mass blocked everyone he had been talking to. So I'm not exactly sure what prompted him to block everybody, but he was seemingly very secure in that he was defeating Taibbi and setting the record straight. But perhaps he regretted sending out a link to the report. I think I would have if I was him. To go on, the EIP gathered nearly 1 billion tweets during the lead up to the election, not 22 million. And they then analyzed those and labeled 22 million as disinformation. And then they analyzed that 22 million to track those tweets to what they called spreader sources or spreader accounts. And those sources were often people and not bots. So those were real people with constitutional rights that they were linking to. But they were also tracking all the other tweets and retweets that were in response to or amplifying the original spreader tweets. And so that was where the 22 million came from. And they were labeled, all of them, as misinformation. They were labeled misinformation after the election when the analysis was done with funding from the federal government through the Federal National Science Foundation. So the only real error that Taibbi made was getting confused about when the Election Integrity Project was formed. It wasn't in 2022 after public pressure made the Department of Homeland Security back off on creating the Disinformation Governance Board, but in 2020. So from the beginning, the Election Integrity Project was tasked with doing what the Department of Homeland Security didn't have the technical or legal ability to do. They were filling the gaps, as Stamos said, for the Department of Homeland Security. So I just wanted to get all that out. What do you think?
Dog, you gonna write a book about this?
I might. I want to. What I've reached out to someone else I'm going to be talking about in a bit is Jacob Siegel. Jacob Siegel wrote a really good piece for Tablet magazine called The Great Disinformation Hoax. And I have reached out to him to get him on the podcast. And, if you were to ever want to write a book, I'd certainly want to publish it. And of course, if Matt Taibbi wants to write a book about this, or Li Fong, or Barry Weiss even, or Schellenberger, or all of them together, we would be like falling over ourselves to publish it. But I haven't thought about writing my own book about this. But the key thing here is what we're talking about is an effort by the Department of Homeland Security to partner with nonprofits in an effort to get technical assistance and to get these nonprofits to do things that the Department of Homeland Security itself doesn't feel legally able to do. So that's one of the things that we're up against here, is that the nonprofit sector being brought in is a kind of shield from the kind of criticism we're making on here. It sounds like someone is singing in the shower nearby.
It's I'm in Greece, and so today is the first day of Holy Week, and you are hearing a priest singing on a loudspeaker outside.
Oh, okay.
But I like the shower hypothesis. That's a good one.
Well, I don't mean to
Well-
insult the priest. I mean, I'm sure he's so yeah.
So
Go ahead.
okay, so this is part of these sorts of things have been kind of taken into account by some people who are trying to argue that there is a shift happening within our I don't know, at least our cultural sphere that is rooted in something economic, and in particular our new sort of information technologies, where, for instance, one paper says the original free, that this is just a conference proceeding, it's gray literature, but anyways, I found it useful. The original free unregulated internet has been colonized, marketed, and dominated by players like the Big Five, Apple, Microsoft, etc., competing for attention, consumption, and money. Politicians and states, afraid of losing power and control, try to censor, control, and regulate, for the bad or for the good, employing persuasive discourses of combating terrorism, protecting citizens, and creating a more efficient society. And they liken this to the states and big corporations both compete and cooperate, just like the states and the church in the Middle Ages. So the internet is something like medieval times. And one of the analogies that I've seen is we sort of cultivate the internet for the lords who extract the surplus. And all of that entails also a strict control of freedoms and so on, a very strong sort of political control. So the internet is not, they argue, a kind of capitalistic sphere. It's more like a feudal sphere, which entails control over the peasantry, their consumption habits, their life, their thought, their religion, all of these sorts of things. And religion, by religion, of course, you would mean like ideology. Yes. And so, yeah. Sorry,
someone says, how is this not just Bonapartism? And I want to underscore that while talk of neo-feudalism deserves to be explored and developed, you and I are not saying that what's happening right now is literally neo-feudalism. I think the main point to make is, I mean, look, for years now, for over a decade, there's been talk on the far right. I think this guy, Goldbug or something, has been talking about the Dark Cathedral and this nexus of the academy, the media, and the state, which is creating a system of control. And they're part of the Dark Enlightenment, and this neo-reactionary critique has been out there. And I am not embracing that, but it has always struck me that there was some truth about the homogeneity of thought through these different sectors, and the state, the academy, the media, and that there is no doubting that there's a shared ethos, a shared perspective amongst that class of people. We could talk about it as a PMC if we wanted. We could talk about it in a variety of ways. Just how we talk about it is important, though, and which is why it's good to be interested in, intrigued by, curious about, and skeptical of critiques that try to label the current moment as somehow a moment of neo-feudalism. But what I would just underline is that in this particular case with Taibbi, and someone asks, since when is Taibbi on the left? And saying he's never been much of a leftist. I just think that's completely missing the point. I mean, of course, he's not a part of our little countercultural milieu, and thank God, because if he was, he would be much more infected with confusion over the question of censorship than he is. I mean, he's a journalist, and he's been brought up within the ethos of journalism and free expression, and serving the public through the telling of accurate stories that give them the information they need to have some say over what happens in society, over what happens in the government. And on the left, we have been so thoroughly defeated that we've often enough lost track. Yeah, Mencius mold bug that I was talking about before. We've often lost track of simple facts like any political movement for socialism will have to struggle to be able to express its ideas and to communicate with and organize together against state oppression, right? And that we've lost track of the idea that our aim is to make radical changes in society, rather than simply protect whatever remnants of democracy or liberal sentiment we might think exist. And so, yeah, Matt Taibbi's not a leftist. You can tell that by the way he approached Marcuse when he wrote about Marcuse recently. But you know what? It's a shame that the people who are critiquing Marcuse today are not leftists and don't have the background in Marxism that might be much more informative if such a critique was launched from the left. I mean, I say that I'm sure somebody somewhere is typing away a critique of Marcuse, and it probably could be brilliant. But the point is that we're not overall turning to our own history to understand it and critique it, and to do that imminent critique of our own movements that is necessary. And instead, the people, other people drag out our dirty laundry and put it out of context, and we look terrible when someone like Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance gets dragged out. So in any case, I'm ranting here, and I'm off from my script.
No, I think that was a good rant. I think that's important to drive home as well. Yeah, I do want to say I'm just exploring this thesis because personally, I am not convinced by it. There's a very good critique by Evgeny Morozov that kind of speaks to, in the New Left Review from almost exactly a year ago, that speaks to some of the misgivings that I have had, and I've not been sort of convinced otherwise by reading a lot of this literature, that I think that the weakness there, before I didn't want to sort of launch into critique before I've kind of gone through and told you sort of what some of this thesis argues. But basically, it seems to me, in spite of the fact that there are some relational kinds of studies that I think are more in, not I think, well, they're definitely more within the Marxist tradition. And there are people like Jody Dean, who is a self-identified communist, who put forward very interesting kinds of ideas. I think for the most part, it seems to be quite qualitative in the sense that people are saying, oh, this thing is like things that happened in medieval society. And, that's not ultimately useful, because you can have all sorts of lists of things where things are qualitatively similar, but that doesn't mean they are literally the same thing. So you can say somebody is like a mother, but they are not a mother, because your relation to that person is not a mother-child relationship. That person acts in a way where a strictly trait or definitional approach would lead you to say that is a mother, but the relation is not there, if you understand what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. So are the relationships that characterize feudalism now coming to dominate capitalism? I'm not so sure. Mm-hmm. Although Varoufakis makes the point that at the beginning, when capitalism was first developing, one could have said, well, this is hyper-feudalism. Because there's a lot, it's not like when history changes, it changes by destroying utterly everything that came before. No, history is made using the materials that are present and are at hand. And so capitalism contains and developed upon and exploded the relationships that dominated feudalism, right? And so you will see within capitalism very similar kinds of relationships, which can lead us astray. Nonetheless, there are a number of things that I think make this thesis worthwhile. There are interesting changes that appear to be happening, and in particular, what we talked about last month around subjectivity and a loss of belief in freedom. Mm. And it makes me wonder, does it speak to a real loss of freedom?
Yeah, I think has to be admitted to be true. We really have lost some freedoms. And the extent to which we've lost our individual freedoms and our societal freedoms I think it is easy for people on the left to say, yes, we've suffered tremendously, a lot of defeats, and we are less free today than we were perhaps during the 19th century when there was a proletariat organizing for revolution. Okay, sure, but we've been losing our individual subjective sense of freedom and our objective freedoms over the last 20 years, certainly since 9/11. And the depth of the intrusion of the security state into our lives should not be ignored any longer. And someone says, Matt exposed corporate repression of free speech. More power to him. Let's move on. And I just want to say, like, okay, first of all, no, it was not that he exposed just the corporate repression of speech. Okay, he exposed the collaboration of not just corporations with the state, but with nonprofits and universities with the state, as they curtailed freedom systematically, not out of some competitive profit motive. But we'll talk about that in a minute, because you notice that Elon Musk is on the thumbnail as the kind of the final, et tu Brutus figure in this. But right now, but the reality is that we've been systematically losing our right to speech and our right to organize, certainly again since 2001. And I want to mention what Jacob Siegel said in his essay, The Great Disinformation Hoax. He says that a big turning point in the systematic dismantling of our constitutionally protected freedoms in the United States occurred, or reoccurred, I would say, in 2016. The claim that Russia hacked the 2016 vote allowed federal agencies to implement a new public-private censorship machinery. This, I'm quoting him now, under the pretext of ensuring election integrity. I'm going to mute you for this bit.
Sorry.
It's okay. So, so the pretext was to ensure election integrity. People who expressed true and constitutionally protected opinions about the 2016 election and later about issues like COVID-19 and the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan were labeled un-American, racist, conspiracists, and stooges of Vladimir Putin. And here's the big part of this: systematically removed from the public digital square to prevent their ideas from spreading disinformation. By an extremely conservative estimate based on public reporting, according to Siegel, there have been tens of millions of such cases of censorship since Trump's election. Now, that's not the 22 million tweets. That's, across the whole spectrum, tens of millions. On January 6, 2017, Jay Johnson, the outgoing Obama-appointed Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, again, I'm quoting Siegel, announced that in response to Russian electoral interference, he had designated the U.S. election system as critical national infrastructure. The move placed the property of 8,000 election jurisdictions across the country under the control of the Department of Homeland Security. After 9/11, the threat of terrorism was used to justify measures like the Patriot Act, this is again Siegel, that suspended constitutional rights and placed millions of Americans under a shadow of mass surveillance. Those policies were once controversial, but have come to be accepted as the natural prerogatives of state power. As the journalist Glenn Greenwald observed, George W. Bush's "with us or with the terrorist" directive provoked a fair amount of outrage at the time, but is now the prevailing mentality within U.S. liberalism and the broader Democratic Party. The war on terror was a dismal failure that ended with the Taliban returning to power in Afghanistan. It also became unpopular with the public. Why then would Americans choose to empower the leaders and sages of that war to be the stewards of an even more expansive war against disinformation? It is possible to venture a guess. Americans did not choose them. Americans are no longer presumed to have the right to choose their own leaders or to question decisions made in the name of national security. Anyone who says otherwise can be labeled a domestic extremist. So, I wanted to read that part.
Well, this is. Oh, did you? Yes, you did. So this is part of the. This is part of the issue that we have, right? That a lack of, and again, part of people put this forward as part of the neo-feudalist thesis, that a lack of trust in each other, a lack of mutual trust, has led to a desire to empower some person above to guide the way, to provide security, to provide some kind of strong stock market or some bureaucratic means that will protect us from whatever threats they claim. And someone asked, is this not just the Bonapartist state? And yes, that's the thing. As I'm reading, I just think, I don't know if it's, well, I don't know. I do know. A lot of people seem to have this sort of strict separation between politics and economics. And so if they see something happening politically that is not liberal, they're like, oh, well, it must be neo-feudal, right? And they're able to sort of rip these things apart. I don't think these things can be ripped apart quite so easily. I think what is happening is this is what capitalism is, and this is what people are trying to, like left figures who are trying to make sense of what's happening. They're all trying to grapple with this fundamental question of what happens to capitalism in the absence of working class pushback. And I think also what happens to capitalism when the working class has been suppressed so successfully. And so you have this is not like an aberration of capitalism. I think sort of conceptualizing what is happening now as a kind of radical change gives capitalism too much credit. As though capitalism was the system truly of both economic and political freedoms. And if you move beyond that or away from that, then it's not capitalism anymore. And in fact, Varoufakis has even said, and I don't know if this is just flourish, just a way of getting attention or something like that, which is fine. But he's like, we don't live in capitalism anymore. You know, we live now in something beyond capitalism, something neo-feudal or something like that, which is an interesting kind of rhetorical kind of way of capturing attention or whatever. Say it's drawing attention to some kind of injustice that is maybe capable of speaking to a broader audience than if you just bang on and on about capitalism. So in that sense, I understand it can be useful. But at the same time, it is saying that it is, or losing sight of the fact that capitalism of necessity shuts down political freedom. And that's just obvious, right? That this is what I keep banging on. I mean, right. Which is a split.
The one way to think about that, I mean, we often think about that as like, oh, in order to suppress the working class and keep them coming to work, we shut down political freedom, as if is already a developed political project to overturn, the wage relations, say, and that isn't true. But that, I mean, they don't want the capitalist state does not want working class people organizing for socialism, certainly not. But beyond that, there's a need, just without worrying about a socialist revolution, for the state to limit freedom. And one of those reasons, right, is in order to make sure that the working class is divided against itself in times of war. In order to limit communication between nations like Russia and the United States, to control the ways in which we think about world events, so that they maintain their power over them. Not to stop us from doing the radical kind of politics that might completely alter the foundation of society, but just even to make sure that they can manage our reaction to the continued crisis that goes on. I mean, one of the real ironies right now is that the people who are putting forward the necessity to control misinformation or disinformation, especially after or during COVID, but even after, even after COVID and today, is that they do it in the name of harm reduction. Okay, they do it in the name of protecting the public from violence, from extremists, from MAGA Republicans, what have you. And today they're talking about harm reduction and the necessity to stop disinformation from being spread by Americans and, just regular citizens around the world. At a moment when there's the Ukraine is being completely decimated by bombs. We don't know the amount of deaths that have been brought about by that invasion and the failure to negotiate any kind of sensible agreement around Ukraine. And we are being told not only that, but we are all living under the threat of nuclear Armageddon. We've been told by the state that we are more at risk from nuclear war today than we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was about 6 minutes away at one point from complete nuclear annihilation. It was only stopped by some submarine commander from the Soviet Union, resisting orders, if I'm remembering that correctly. So this talk about harm reduction acts as though the status quo, the powers that be, these nonprofit corporations and the academics at the University of Washington and the agents within the Department of Homeland Security and their lackeys at MSNBC like Mehdi Hassan, all these people are really doing a terrific job of keeping us safe. They are benign forces in the world. Meanwhile, we know that whole apparatus has set us up right now to risk nuclear annihilation. How many years after the collapse of the Soviet Union? 33 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War, after mutual assured destruction was off the table. We're back here again. So no, I'm sorry. The status quo, the powers that be, the establishment, whether they be Mehdi Hassan or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or Ted Cruz or Paul Ryan or Donald Trump, none of them are keeping us remotely protected from harm. Okay, that is just an absurdity and kind of an obscenity to suggest that. And when people stand up at the UN and put on this air of concern and deep hurt and traumatization around the possibility of being hurt by disinformation, those people should be, I think, when I was growing up, my mother said that when she'd meet some upper class family, not that we weren't upper class, but the particular kind of upper class family, she would want to take their kids and roll them in the mud. Well, these people should be rolled in the mud. These people should be dirtied up. They need to be, their shit stinks. Okay. And that's there. I'll stop there. So I'm getting very homespun. My mama told me. Anyways.
Well, this is the thing, is that it's like, across the political spectrum, this is the thing that drives me nuts, is like, there's just nothing that doesn't operate on this logic, right? It's everybody's promise, everybody's bigging up some threat so they can promise to protect you from it. Like, they're gonna exterminate all of us, whatever insert group here. They're gonna exterminate us. That's what they're saying. They're gonna exterminate us. Or like using like rape culture. Everything is like just enormous hyperbole and just bigging up threats, and then we'll rescue you. We'll save you. And that's all that it is. It's just, it's really scary, because you just see like the possibility of like some sort of ridiculous, absurd, like rainbow military junta or something there to like protect you from the possibility of the thing. They become the thing that they claim they're going to save you from. It's if you think too much.
Spencer Leonard told me something the other day that I think we should keep in mind. It's like one of the groups of people that should be the most infuriated with the Democratic Party and with this entire establishment right now should be like transgender people, because they're being held up as freaking scapegoats for these bureaucrats in DC and no, this has nothing to do with trans rights. Okay, you're not protecting trans rights, and no trans person is being served. There's not some hidden trans ideology at work and in the election integrity project. That is a red herring. That is a distraction. That is an excuse. But yeah, go ahead.
Or I've just been pulling up comments. But yeah, so like the idea is that this is the I don't know, the malaise that is expressed during capitalism in crisis, or perhaps capitalism in decline. But when there is no positive, or when there's no working class movement capable of opposing it in a real and organized way. That doesn't mean that workers are not opposing their own exploitation. They are everywhere, all over the place, but not in a united way. It's very much sort of sporadic. And then the question for us is, my question was, this is my question that's been sort of guiding me at the moment, is, does this reflect, is it possible that without any kind of pushback that we could literally regress? Is it possible that we could literally regress to something worse than capitalism? In fact, Morozov begins his New Left Review essay by saying, well, the good news is that we've finally begun to imagine the end of capitalism. The bad news is we can only imagine it as a dystopian shift to something worse. And I don't want to fall into that. But at the same time, it's hard to see areas in which there's some space to escape. That's what I mean by, is this a real loss of freedom? Is there really no way out? In the absence of any kind of organization that can come to know itself and be aware of its interests and represent the interests of humanity, in the absence of that, what happens next? I mean, but of course, this is an urgent question for me, because I think that there is a falling rate of profit, right? And if you don't think that, maybe the question is not so urgent.
Well, I think that there's a falling rate of profit as well, and I do think that, and by that, what the consequences of that seem to me to be that that the free market and the idea of an international system of cooperation, of production and exchange, and the rational working out of capital and wage labor and commodity production is just off the table, right? That none of that is going to be in our future, and that we're going to have some sort of radical break with society as we know it in order to maintain the technological advances and I'm going to mute your priest. And the technological advances and social advances and kinds of freedoms that we've managed to develop even under capitalism. So I totally agree with you. But on the other hand, if you look at Alex Stamos's tweets, or you read the Washington academics' defense of their practices, or you listen carefully to Mehdi Hassan, these people are not, Superman. They're not masters of the universe. They're, kind of simpering, toady, bootlicking heels. And, they're, and I know these people. I'm in Portland, for Christ's sake. I've been at lawn parties and barbecues with them, with people like them, their kids or with them. Really, I mean, they don't think of themselves or conceive of themselves as masters of the universe either. They're just doing their job, trying to get ahead in the rat race of academia or the rat race of corporate America. So they're not invincible. They have a lot of power, and they can do things that are terrifically violent. But Stamos won't do it, but someone somewhere might. And it is worth noting that Taibbi was visited by the IRS on the very day that he gave testimony to Congress, that they sent the IRS to his house. Not because they had any reason to audit him, but just to let him know that they could. And the other day, this will be coming up soon, I was talking to Todd McGowan, about all this. And I said, look, when AOC says that the Mehdi Hassan interview demonstrates there's nothing to see here when it comes to censorship of the internet, and that we've been wasting taxpayer dollars trying to pull together congressional hearings on the topic. She's not different in fundamentally in principle from Putin. That the desire to control the media is the same, and the authoritarianism is the same. And McGowan was like, "Oh, come on, Doug. If it was Putin, she would have just had Taibbi killed." And I thought about that for a second. I said, well, if Taibbi was killed tomorrow, how many of us would be able to recognize it as a political assassination? So in any case, we should just be aware that on the one hand, they're just human beings and not impressive, really. And on the other hand, yeah, they are tremendously violent.
Is that where we're headed then? Is that what you think?
No, damn it. There's an independent media, and we still like. Oh, let me tell you. Here's another example of why we shouldn't be so scared. We don't have the freedoms that we once had, but to a large extent, not completely, but in the United States, to a large extent, that's because we're not exercising them. Okay. Even when it comes to this massive censorship campaign, that interview with Todd McGowan I referred to, it was taken down by YouTube because we talked about the vaccines, and they said we were violating community guidelines and removed it. And they said, this is a warning. The next time you do something like this, you'll get a strike. If you get 3 of those, your channel is completely taken down. And so I demanded a manual review, and I tweeted at YouTube. And in my demand for a review and my tweets at YouTube, I think both times I mentioned the fact that I was aware of the Virality Project, which was a NGO in conjunction with the state project to set up terms of service and create and alert media people across the board about disinformation narratives. And that had been brought together during the pandemic. And so that I was aware that by removing my video that they were violating my First Amendment rights. And within 45 minutes, it was reinstated. Okay. There is a legal question here. If these companies have been violating thousands and thousands of Americans' First Amendment rights, there's a possibility of a class action lawsuit against them, maybe not against the state. That wouldn't solve the problem, but there's still some recourse even within the system. There's some exposure for them on this. And we should be aware of that fact. Like, we don't have to just lay down and take it or cower in a corner and worry. And when Mehdi Hassan does a hit job on us, that may look bad for a day or so, but we have the recourse. We can hit back. We can talk back. So anyway.
Yeah, for the time being, but I think you can see where these things are being eroded continually, right? And from ostensible progressives, there's always a reason.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for the left to, the left that we know, the people that we know, the milieu that we know about, the American milieu, I guess, and the British milieu, to get its head out of its ass and stand up to this. This is a moment where we're really all being called upon to divorce the Democrats and stand up for everyday people and each other. And I don't know how much confidence I have in the entirety of my milieu to come around, but I think there are more people out there who understand this than it appears on Twitter. And so
yeah, absolutely. I think it's the people who are the loudest, or the people who believe that they should have a seat at the board and no one else, right? But most people, as we've said before, I think was like this one little like glimmer of light that we could go toward, is that most people actually believe that they are capable of holding these freedoms. Most people believe that they are capable of taking in information and rationally judging how to act. Doesn't mean that they will always make the right decisions, but at least there's some like logical process there. Most people hold that, they still do. It's the sort of, I don't know, people who are, you know, the sort of NGO class and all of that sort of thing, people in these kinds of positions that tend on the whole to have a very low opinion of everyday people that they themselves don't have. In fact, as I've said before, the fact that people believe that is something that they see as a problem. The fact that people are still have this illusion that they are rational, that they are capable of exercising freedoms, and that they want them. That's part of the problem. That was the big problem in COVID. By the way, I love this comment here at the end of Zero Books. You should have done a whole bunch of COVID videos. We should have done.
Yeah, that would have been a good idea.
It's all. We should have just appeared with literal tinfoil hats on our heads.
There were a number of things I could have done as I was leaving the YouTube channel for Zero Books that would have caused them trouble, but I didn't do those things.
Boo hiss.
Listen, why don't we wrap it up here? I'll put a link to the second half. I feel like I really ranted in that we had a nice like A-B podcast. Like I would rant about, you know, free speech, and you would take a step back and talk about the question of neo-feudalism, and they kind of blended together. But I have to admit that I'm very one track right now, and I apologize for that. But let's.
Well, I am too. But I think what you're speaking to is this big question that I am also trying to answer. Is like how, first of all, we need to understand our cultural forms, and so you need to understand like exactly what's happening. You can't just assume like, oh, there's this problem, and then just go into like, oh, there must be some economic change. You have to really understand what it is. And I'm trying to kind of point to these qualitative, yes, this fits in with these sort of qualitative characteristics that people are associating with neo-feudalism, but I am not feeling or seeing the link to something deeper that is changing in our core relationships within capitalism. So for me, I think this is really helpful to me to kind of see that, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to make sense of this shit, but I just don't see it as anything other than the shift, the separation between economic and political liberalism, and that in service of economic liberalism, political liberalism, capitalism will kill political liberalism. These things are not compatible within capitalism for very long. They were, but now they are not, because what people will demand is a freedom that will go against the logic of capitalism, and we can't have that.
I want to point out one last thing that it kind of echoes what you're saying, but in a specific way, which is that the final nail in the coffin for Taibbi. I mean, he's not dead, and who knows what's going to happen next. But he went on vacation right after this Mehdi Hassan interview, and right before he left, he left Twitter as well, and apparently will no longer be reporting on the Twitter files. Why? Because Elon Musk decided that he was going to block all links from Twitter to Substack. Why? Because Twitter is hemorrhaging money. It's not making any money, and he's desperately trying to monetize it, right? So they're going to start having their own version of Substack on Twitter. They're going to create something like Substack for Twitter, and meanwhile, Substack is going to have its own version of Twitter, or has already implemented or rolled out something called Notes, which I guess is something like Twitter, but on Substack. And so because Substack is seen as a competitor with Twitter, which should show you how little money Twitter is making, Musk blocked links to them. Now, maybe he also blocked links to Substack because he was unhappy with Matt Taibbi's performance on MSNBC. Maybe it was because he's a defense contractor on top of everything else, and someone in the state said, hey, you know what? This has gone on far enough now. Let's put it into this. Who knows what all of his motivations might have been. But the fact that we know for sure is that because of the need to monetize Twitter, and because of the fact that this tech platform was heavily financialized and relied on low interest rates to exist, and now we have much higher interest rates, the Twitter files and public reporting couldn't be completed, didn't get completed. And, it's come down to the whim of some billionaires to whether or not there's investigative reporting. That's another way in which economics and the political impact political reality.
Okay, after the break, we will come back on Patreon and I will go through the characteristics that have been listed as indicative of Neofeudalism.
Sorry, I cut you off there. I was just like, no, let me answer media thoughts.
No, I did bring in a lot of them, actually. And we will see whether or not. So here's the thing that gives me pause. Hegel said, the point of departure is the point of return, but sublated. Why would Marx think that the point of return would be sublated primitive communism and not sublated feudalism? Because that's where capitalism came from. Just something to leave you with. Why would we return to communism and not feudalism? That has always given me pause.
That's a fucking bummer. All right. Okay. I'm going to hit this button here.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential